What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brooke. Welcome back to another Crafter Workshop video. And this is actually my first video on the Rockler YouTube channel. In case you're not familiar with my channel, again, Crafter Workshop, I put out pretty much weekly how-to videos on woodworking, metalworking, leather, electronics. If you enjoy watching people make furniture and all that kind of stuff, definitely go check out my channel. But in this week's project, I'm gonna show you how I built this really cool kind of modern wine rack. So it was fairly simple. It was just a lot of different parts and pieces. So I think it was just more time consuming than it was complicated, but I love the way it came out. I built it out of solid ash and then stained the inside with India ink and then sealed that with polyurethane. Really clean design and holds 16 bottles of wine. And the nice thing is you could build more of these as your wine collection grows, if it does, and easily stack them or put them next to each other, and they would look really good together. So hopefully you guys enjoy this one. Let's go ahead and get started with the project. I started this project like I do all my projects, breaking down my boards into smaller pieces. So I built this project out of 8-quarter ash, and this was actually the first time I'd ever worked with ash, but definitely won't be my last. The first pieces I worked on were the outer frame, and after cutting the pieces to rough length at the miter saw, I milled the pieces square on the jointer and planer. Now if you don't have a jointer and planer, you can just buy pre-milled lumber. I wanted a final thickness of 3/4 of an inch, so I left the boards a little bit thicker here so I could bring them down to final thickness later. Now the ash wasn't wide enough to make up the 8.5 inch wide frame pieces, so I needed to glue one of the wider pieces to a narrower strip to get my full width. I ripped the pieces to width at the table saw, which also cleaned up that last rough edge. Next, I glued up the boards into panels. I used dominoes for alignment here, but dowels or biscuits would also work in the same way. After about an hour, I scraped off the glue squeeze out, and then a few hours after that, I took the panels out of the clamps and ran them through my planer and drum sander to clean them up and bring the boards down to their final thickness of 3/4 of an inch. With the boards at their final thickness, I cut them to final length at the miter saw, and a stop block really helps to ensure all of your pieces are the exact same length here. For the joinery on the frames, I used dominoes, but once again, dowels would work great here. Rockler's 3/8 inch dowel drilling jig would make drilling the holes for the dowels super quick. I used 8mm by 50mm dominoes and added 2 per corner, which should be plenty strong. Since I was going to be staining the frame and keeping the inner grid its natural color, I needed to pre-finish the inside of the frame. So before staining, I sanded the inside faces of the frame up to 180 grit and also broke the sharp edges. I also needed to tape off the areas where I'd be applying glue when assembling the frames later, as the finish would keep the glue from sticking well. For the stain, I used India ink, which is something I've used in the past with a lot of success. This Speedball India ink actually has shellac in it, so it adheres really well to wood and soaks right in. I just wiped on a heavy coat, making sure to get the ink down into the open grain of the ash, and then let it dry for a few hours. After the India ink dried, I top coated it with 3 coats of water-based polyurethane, which helps to seal the ink and also protect it. Next, I could start working on the grid, which actually holds the wine bottles. I used the same 4/4 ash again and cut the boards to rough length, got 2 faces flat and parallel on the jointer and planer, and then ripped the boards into strips at the bandsaw. And I went with the bandsaw here as it has a much thinner kerf, which meant I'd waste a lot less wood and get more strips out of the same boards. And I wanted the strips to have a final dimension of 1/2 inch square, so I ripped them to about 5/8 of an inch to give myself some room to flatten the strips. Next, I brought the strips to their final dimension at the planer. Also, you might notice that I have a ton of these strips, and that's because I actually built 3 of these wine racks. You need 50 strips per rack, so I had 150 strips to deal with, plus a few extra in case any of them got damaged. To cut the strips to final length, I gang cut them using my crosscut sled, cutting about 6 strips on each pass. I first squared up one end of all the strips, and then set up a stop block using a square and cut the strips to their final length. Next, I needed to cut the half laps into the strips to create the grid. I used this handy cross lap jig from Rockler for this, which attaches to your miter gauge and allows you to reference off of the previously cut joints so you get nice even spacing. First, I needed to cut 1 half lap about 1.5 inches in from the end of the strips, and I referenced off the metal indexing key on the jig to do this. After cutting that first half lap into all the strips, I adjusted the jig so that there was a spacing of 3 3/4 of an inch between the joints, and I could slip the previously cut half lap over the indexing key, cut the next half lap, and just repeat. This jig references off of the previously cut half lap, so you get perfect spacing between your joints as long as you have the jig set up properly. And this is what you'll end up with after cutting all of the half laps. With all the joints cut, next I could move on to gluing up the grids. And I made sure not to apply too much glue here as I wanted to avoid too much glue squeeze out. And I also clamped each joint individually to make sure they were nice and tight. and I found it was better to do this a few rows at a time after this first glue up. It just became really hard to manage with 25 clamps on the grid. After this first glue up, I would just add 2 rows using 10 clamps instead of 25, and then let the glue set up for about 30 minutes, and then remove the clamps and move on to the next couple of rows. Next, I needed to flatten all the joints and get the grids nice and smooth. I also ended up at a little under ½ an inch after milling the strips originally, which resulted in kind of a loose fit with the test joints I cut with the hollow chisel mortiser. Because of this, I decided to bring the grids down to 3/8 of an inch thick using my drum sander. And this would allow me to use a 3/8 inch chisel on the hollow chisel mortiser and get a nice tight joint. Obviously, this wouldn't be a necessary step as long as you keep your strips at ½ an inch thick, but this did have the bonus of smoothing out all the grids, which meant less sanding for me. After drum sanding, I was left with some pretty sharp edges on the grids, so I broke the edges with some hand sanding, which was incredibly tedious, but unfortunately a necessary process. With the grids sanded, I could seal the inside faces with some spray shellac, and these would have been next to impossible to finish once the wine racks were assembled, so I figured pre-finishing was my best bet here. Next, I could get to cutting the mortises into the frames. Again, I used a hollow chisel mortiser here, so I first needed to lay out the locations of the mortises. I used painter's tape here since the faces were pre-finished, and just matched the spacing to the grid spacing. I also made sure to transfer the lines from the same board to the other boards once I had my layout marked out so that all the mortise locations matched. I set the fence on the mortise to cut about ½ an inch in from the edges of the boards and then got to cutting. Since the strips on the grids ended up at 3/8 of an inch by ½ an inch, I had to cut the mortises in 2 passes, but this actually ended up making for a cleaner mortise than using the larger ½ inch chisel I had tried on my test cuts. The process goes pretty quick, but I had 120 mortises to cut since I was building 3 of these, so it did take a little bit of time. Also, if you've never used a hollow chisel mortiser, it requires a good bit of force to cut the mortises, so I was pretty beat after this process. With all the mortises cut, I could move on to the glue up, which was definitely a little bit tricky due to the sheer number of mortises and tenons that needed to be lined up. Some of the strips actually warped a little bit between the time I made the grids and the time I assembled the racks, which was actually a couple weeks in real life, so I had to use a clamp to pull some of the strips together to get them into the mortises in some spots, but eventually I got it all assembled. I also clamped the racks diagonally if I needed to square them up at all. I also made sure not to use too much glue here again because I really didn't want a ton of squeeze out to deal with. These joints are incredibly strong even without glue, so you don't need a ton. After the glue dried, I sanded the outside faces and edges up to 180 grit. Once again, I sprayed on 3 coats of polyurethane to seal the grids and frames. Finally, I added some rubber feet to the bottom of the wine racks, and all that was left to do was to load it up with some wine.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I'm really happy with the way this thing came together. My wife and I were using a really kind of ugly wine rack that we picked up at a flea market years ago previously, and this one just fits our home decor and style so much better. I'm really liking working with ash here lately too. Because of the emerald ash borer, ash prices have come way down, so it's extremely cheap for a good quality hardwood. And I really like the way it looks. I especially like that kind of black stain because you still see that kind of open grain pattern, but it gives it a little bit of a cleaner, modern look. Again, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. If you don't already subscribe to my channel, Crafted Workshop, go ahead and check that out. I'll put a link here on the screen as well as in the video description. And while you're there, go ahead and check out some of my other project videos. I think you guys are gonna like them. So thanks again to Rockler for having me, and until next time, happy building.